it really is the worst of both worlds. They've basically done a deal in principle that says we, the UK, will be part of the EU's food and drink laws. Of course, we don't get a say in those laws, but we just agree to operate them. We're seeing some of the farming sector's protests. We're seeing some of the relatively high-tech agri-food companies say, hang on a minute, the EU rules are going to stop us doing this. Are you sure that's what you want? So now they are desperately trying to sort of rescue a few concessions. So that's one area. The other is energy. We're going to rejoin the EU's electricity market. We're going to rejoin the EU's emissions trading scheme, which, by the way, is more expensive than ours. Again, without any say in the rules that set these things. The worst of both worlds is to be in these rules without any say in them. Either you're in it and you're around the table talking about it, or you're out of it and you can do your own thing in a way that suits you.
Lord Frost, welcome to the LFG Podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So many of our listeners will know who you are, but for those who don't, could you give a bit of your history and what you do now? Yeah, sure. So I'm probably best known for having been the Brexit negotiator, the EU negotiator in Boris Johnson's government. But actually most of my life I was a civil servant, a British diplomat. I worked in various places in Europe and the US, finished up as ambassador in Denmark. I then went to run a great trade association, the Scotch Whisky Association up in Edinburgh for 3 years, which was great fun. And I would probably still be there if Boris hadn't tempted me back to come and work with him on Brexit. So I became a minister under his when he was Prime Minister. I then left government rather in protest at COVID, and since then have been campaigning for free markets and growth. What were you up to at the Scotch Whisky Association? That sounds quite interesting. So it was good fun. It's one of Britain's biggest trade associations, actually, and it's Britain's single biggest food and drink export, 5 billion or so every year. And it was a great trade association. We did a lot of expertise in sort of international trade, WTO, EU single market issues at the time, legal enforcement of trademarks, all this kind of stuff that makes trade really tick, I suppose, day to day. And I had some great fun getting out all around Scotland to a lot of places I would never have been to in any other circumstances, seeing all the distilleries and seeing the industry. And it is a really great industry. I loved it. People do love it. And it's, it should be better known, I think, in Britain.
You must have got a lot of nice work perks, nice testing you had to go around. It sounds like a tough gig, right?
There's a little of that, though. I think because so many people thought that it was sort of drinking club, actually the culture was kind of the reverse, that there weren't bottles sitting around mostly, and, we were quite careful at this sort of thing. So we didn't want to give the wrong impression. It was a professional organisation,
That's all, and that's profit, right? That's the product you keep for, Oh no, cool. So I mean, we can't have you on the podcast, and we can't and not get into kind of your role as chief negotiator during the leaving the EU. And I'd be interested to take an angle of focusing on, you were obviously a diplomat before, and it's slightly different, right? You were a diplomat, and then you came in to then lead negotiations on behalf of the government on an incredibly political issue, and you had obviously had experience before of working in government. Now you're in this role. Can you just talk a little bit about how you found that transition from being in the civil service to this far more politically charged role, and what elements of it you found the state was doing really well at, and what areas were there big deficits and we weren't prepared for?
Sure. Well, I think I'm unusual in having been a civil servant and special advisor, so political advisor, and then a minister. So there aren't many who've done all three of those, I think. And, you do get a perspective on it that the few others have got. And I think my advantage in the Brexit period was that I had the professional knowledge of Europe. I'd been posted in Brussels. I'd been back and forth there quite a lot, posted in Paris and so on. I had the kind of networks, and I knew the ropes in a way that somebody who'd just been parachuted in wouldn't have. But also I was a believer, and I had the politics in me that most of the professionals didn't have at the time. Brexit was not particularly favoured in the British Foreign Office, I think it's fair to say.
It's surprising.
So that was my big advantage. And I think one of the reasons why the Theresa May round of negotiations before we came in with Boris as PM, why that failed was that they never, I mean, there were many reasons, but one of them was they hadn't found the right sort of personnel. They were trying to do it in a unpolitical way, and they weren't bringing people kind of along with them in the right way. So these sort of big issues that cross bureaucracy and politics, you need people who also cross those things, and so that was my advantage. So the way we did it was essentially we constituted our own team. I basically sort of hunted around Whitehall for people who are willing to come and work in Number 10 and in the negotiating team. And a bit of that was like personal contacts and so on. But we bypassed the bureaucracy. We didn't allow, any of the mainstream departments to do it. We constituted our own team, and it was run by me. Strictly speaking, a special advisor isn't allowed to give instructions, but everyone understood the politics of this. And several people, as we went through this process said to me, it worked really well because you knew enough of the detail to understand what was going on, but you understood the politics and could direct us. And I think it's easy to forget that a lot of civil servants, they'll only see ministers occasionally. They don't necessarily live and breathe the political environment that actually is motivating the politicians most of the time. And you need to kind of tell them and explain it and communicate what you're trying to do and why, what are the trade-offs, what's important, what isn't. All of that helps them do a better job as well. So I think that's why it worked, or at least I think it worked.
And that kind of relationship side may surprise some listeners and may not, but how much of an advantage did you see that as? The fact that you had relationships in Brussels, you had relationships in Paris. Diplomacy is people talking to other people. I've seen it very much like they know you, they trust you. If all they've ever seen of you is on the news, they have their own conceptions of who you are, whereas you've been in the rooms of them, you've talked to them. How much of an advantage did you see that as, almost being able to talk to them, like you're working with colleagues, people you've worked with before, it's kind of a level of trust before?
I mean, a bit. It always helps to have a bit of a network, though it's unusual to be able to keep up the connections, if you see what I mean. If you're lucky, if you know somebody in your 30s and then in your 50s you happen to be in the same rooms again, it often doesn't really work out like that. So it only helps up to a point. I think, I actually think what's more important in negotiation, and this was a particularly odd one in many ways, but in general, it's more important to think about what your interests are and how you explain them and how you communicate them than it is to worry about the kind of personal relationships. I think one of the besetting sins of the British Foreign Office and the way it goes about things is that it wants to be liked all the time, and it just wants to kind of be friends. And I remember in the early stages people saying to me things like, well, this point isn't important to us, why don't we just concede it to produce goodwill? And you have to say, no, you have to hold it back until you can get something for it. They're doing the same. You have to work out what the trade-offs are here. And I think, again, another reason why the Theresa May, Ollie Robbins bit of the negotiations failed is they never made the psychological shift between being part of the EU club to leaving it. and, being an adversarial partner. And, we were quite adversarial in the way we went about it, because we knew we had to reset the kind of mess that had been made by the Theresa May regime before us. We'd had this whole long period where British negotiators had said something that, we could never concede on point X, Y, or Z, and then conceded them, and constantly being pulled back and said things that they wouldn't stand by. And we just knew we had to reset all that. We had to be 100% clear that when we said things, we meant them. And that's why I got this reputation for being rather sort of brutal, I suppose, in the way we put things. But it was necessary, I think, to get the job done.
Given what you've just said, what do you make of our current government's relationship with the EU, where it's headed, but also other trade negotiations that they're a part of?
I mean, funnily enough, they seem to be not doing too bad a job on the non-EU trade negotiations. Some of that is inherited. A lot of them was started under the previous government. They are often not so kind of high political in quite the same way. You're basically trying to find an interest of a balance between your country's industries and theirs, and the different kind of business groups and so on. And there's a fairly well understood routine for how you go about these things. And this government's got the India deal. They've not done too badly with the Americans. There are one or two others in the pipeline. Of course, they could never do those things if we weren't out of the EU in the first place. But I think they're not doing them too badly, because people now they kind of know the ropes of how to do it to a much greater extent. The EU one, I mean, I'm afraid we're just back to the same old game where, the EU seems to be playing all the old tricks on us that we should have by now learned to resist. They'll say, we can't talk about this subject until you've agreed something on this other subject. So they agree something, and then they just kind of pulled along each time, refusing to stand firm, refusing to kind of do real trade-offs, saying that they won't concede things and then doing so. And of course, they're not that bothered. The government, wants to get bit by bit close to the EU. They don't really care if they're conceding stuff. In a way, they see it as an advantage, because their goal is just to move closer. But each time we're selling away things that are going to be quite difficult to get back.
What elements, or what things that are they selling away that you're most worried about, that you think could be most detrimental for the future of Britain?
Well, I'm most worried about about two things, really. One, food and drink, so-called SPS rules, where they've basically done a deal in principle that says we, the UK, will be part of the EU's food and drink laws. Of course, we don't get a say in those laws, but we just agree to operate them. And the idea is it removes these so-called trade barriers between us and the rest of the EU. I don't think these are very big barriers, to be honest, but anyway. But the problem with that is that A, we don't get any say. B, already in the 4 years since we left, we're already doing quite a few things differently to how the EU does them. And I've noticed in the media in recent weeks, we're seeing some of the farming sector's protests. We're seeing some of the relatively high-tech agri-food sort of gene editing type companies say, hang on a minute, the EU rules are going to stop us doing this. Are you sure that's what you want? So now they are desperately trying to sort of rescue a few concessions in this negotiation that allows these things to carry on. But even if they achieve them, it won't solve the general problem that inevitably in future there will be industries that we could have developed but will not be able to develop because EU rules will make them impossible. So that's one area. The other is energy, net zero. We're going to rejoin the EU's electricity market. We're going to rejoin the EU's emissions trading scheme, which, by the way, is more expensive than ours. Again, without any say in the rules that that set these things. So we're essentially in these areas going to get locked into the EU's definition of net zero and its targets and the rules that are necessary to implement them without any power to change these things. I mean, it really is the worst of both worlds. Economically, I would defend Brexit on political, constitutional, democratic grounds, which I think are the most important. But economically, the worst of both worlds is to be in these rules without any say in them. Either you're in it and you're around the table talking about it, or you're out of it and you can do your own thing in a way that suits you. But to be in this kind of middle ground is just disaster, I think, for us.
And where do you think that stems from? Because I remember during a Brexit debate, that was one of the arguments that people were saying of like, we're going to end up having to follow rules and having no say over them. And obviously the counter argument was, well, if we sign up to do that, then yes, but who would sign up to that? Is this just kind of, I guess one part of it, and trying to avoid hindsight bias, but the idea of we should have always been aware that our state capacity and our state ability to kind of have a clear vision on what they want and what we want to achieve has been severely limited over the last 2 decades, and therefore we should have expected the worst, kind of outcome of this situation where you're, as you say, you're tied to these rules because you don't really know what else to do, so you've got no vision beyond that. But then we can't have a say over them, so we're kind of in this worst situation.
Yeah.
So taking out like a broader point, where do you kind of think the governing parties, Conservative, Labour, have kind of lost that vision? Arguably, the last one to really have it was Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and maybe David Cameron, you could say as well. George Osborne, there was something there. At least cut the state, but that was we'd have to go into the details of it. But yes, you kind of broader point of where.
I do think actually it's a bit connected to the EU issue. This, because I think as the EU became more and more intrusive in more and more areas over the last couple of decades, 2 or 3 decades, the British establishment, it's my strong view, they basically forgot how to govern the country. They just they were so used to outsourcing it to Brussels or Strasbourg, so used to not having to define their own interests properly, or rather only defining British interests as some sort of balance between all the other players, that they stopped thinking hard about, okay, what do we need? And that habit, that mindset kind of spread, well beyond things that were in the EU's own competences. It spread to this kind of kind of learned helplessness that we saw so much of, where the government's just a kind of commentator on events rather than aspiring to make things happen. And I just think we've seen so much of this kind of play out. I mean, it's been played out brutally, obviously, since the referendum and since we left. But I think even before that, our establishment had stopped thinking hard about how a market economy works and what the trade-offs are. And, they talked vacuously about spreading the proceeds of growth rather than how you kept growth going. And I genuinely think a lot of them at some subliminal level thought Thatcher Major and a bit of Blair had fixed the British economic problem, and now it was going to be fine and we could just spend all the money. And instead, obviously, it's just sort of run down since then. They haven't kept the fuel in and the engines gradually slowed down. And that's because they've just not thought hard. They haven't explained. They haven't made the case. And as a result, they've got a electorate that to quite a large extent just doesn't really understand the trade-offs. And I'm old enough to remember the Thatcher Major era, and the Thatcher government was all the time kind of communicating these nostrums about how an economy works. You can't pay yourself more than you earn, all this kind of stuff. And you just don't hear that now. People aren't confronted with choices in the same way. And that's a big part of the problem, I think.
Obviously, recently you left as a Conservative Party member. You've kind of said that part is now done. You're not be affiliated to a political party. Why was that? Why did you feel the need to kind of distance yourself and kind of take a step back from the political arena?
Partly the split on the right at the moment makes it quite hard for people to kind of know where to put their efforts, I think. And partly that, I guess I just felt that, what interests me is, apart from the European question, is the ideas, and to try and do a little bit to get these ideas across and explain them again without worrying about, am I cutting across party policy here, or am I making life awkward for anybody or whatever. I can just sort of say what I think. And I got into trouble with the Tory party back in 24 for some of this stuff, and I didn't want it to happen again. So that's really why.
So you won't be the next Conservative to move to Reform?
Yeah. Well, I'd never say never about anything when the election gets a bit closer. Let's see how politics looks. But, there's a job to do at the IEA, obviously, and that's where I'm focusing.
What do you think? Why do you think? I guess you'd probably say the last 20 years, but why free market ideas haven't really had much of a place in the UK?
I think it's partly, as I said, just communicating it didn't happen. The politicians, those who at least purported to believe in these things, didn't take it seriously enough, didn't explain it, didn't communicate, or tended to take the easy way out on a lot of these questions. But I think it's also, as Adam Smith said, there's a good deal of ruin in a nation, and it takes a long time before the problems become obvious. And, a lot of countries, just carry on going down the slides, really. They never find a Lady Thatcher who is able to kind of put the brakes on in time and turn the car around. We got lucky in many ways in the 70s. And I remember, even at my young age then, people saying, Britain's finished, it's ungovernable, we can't recover it. And yes, it did turn out to be recovered. And, there's lots of echoes of that today, I think. We've just allowed too much to slip. We've allowed tax, spend, regulation, all these things to creep up, and now we can finally see the economy has simply stopped growing in per capita terms. Finally, you look around and the country by and large doesn't look great, and people can finally see, there's a problem. But now you've got 20 years of accumulated mess to clear up, and that looks quite difficult for politicians.
One of the reasons I think I joined LFG was because I think growth is basically the only way that we have out of the situation that we have now. I was wondering to what extent do you think that the way our economy is structured is almost immovable at the moment, and the trade-offs are too politically difficult to get through, or are going to cause great kind of economic worry. I was just wondering your thoughts, and could you just do it with the state of the economy of Britain now and change things around, or do you think we do need to have good amounts of growth behind that?
The problem is everything's connected to everything else.
Yeah.
And where do you start? What do you choose as you weigh in to beginning to sort of unravel this horrible mess that's been created? And it's easy enough to define the tasks. You've got to get tax down, you've got to get spending down, you've got to deregulate, we've got to reform the planning system, we've got to get out of net zero, we've got to reform the NHS. We have to do all these things, but they can't all be done at the same time. You have to set out a programme. Where are you going to start? What are the easy wins that get people thinking, okay, maybe we can do a bit of this? And again, if you look, the Thatcher government isn't the touchstone for everything, and there's a lot of mythology about it. But, although they ended up being a very reforming government, they actually only attacked it bit by bit. First with inflation, that was the main problem at the time. Even trade union reform, which now seems like one of the main things they did, they only approached very slowly. Privatisation didn't really happen at all until the second term, and it's because of this need to maintain confidence, I think. And even then it was very difficult. So I see the problem of growth. It's not so much as defining what to do. That's obvious, I think. It's how are we going to do it? What order are we going to do things in that starts changing the perceptions and the political economy of it? And we're talking about a 10-year programme here to get back to normal, at least, I think.
I think it's two interesting angles I often find in the kind of argument of how do you move the kind of philosophy of a country or the kind of mood of a country towards free market. These discussions I had with various people, and you have the one which is like market confidence, and I'm probably personally more bullish or more optimistic of the idea of actually the markets would favour a lot of material, like a lot of this action. They got spooked during Liz Truss. There's a lot of reasons for that, which partly for tax cuts, partly the pension set up and the Bank of England and all of that, and then also the fact that there was no supply side reform alongside, so you didn't have just looked like unfunded. It was just completely unfunded, and it was just promised that we'll sort out the supply later on. So I kind of get innately the markets, especially for financial markets, are aligned in the idea of a free market. That's how they exist. They see how the US functions as a far kind of more free market than we have, and that in a way makes kind of a compelling argument in my view of there is a way out there to do it relatively quickly, to make those changes in a kind of a shorter time frame of 10 years. The other one which I find more challenging is the kind of the cultural element of the country. And right now, when you say there's issues we need to solve, we've got no growth, GDP per capita is at best stagnant, wages, house prices, all these kind of issues. The automatic view of a country is, or many people in the country is, what are the government going to do about it?
Yeah.
How are you going to spend more to solve this problem for me? How are you going to tax X group or raise more taxes so you can spend more on Y? Or where are you going to regulate to stop an industry or stop kind of perceived misalignment in the market, as you're seeing with rent controls, for instance?
It's a good example.
And the argument from your side would be actually we've got to do the reverse. The state needs to be pared back.
Yes.
It's more freedom for people to be able to do stuff, businesses to create, to cover the void. How do you make that argument?
I mean, I think you've just got to try and show it, and I think, for example, if we'd not lost our nerve in 2020, 21 on planning reform, the generic reforms, I think we would have seen quite a difference. I mean, they didn't go far enough, obviously, but I think they would have changed quite a bit. People would have seen some of the consequences. Unfortunately, we lost the nerve, which in a way sort of proves your point, I suppose. But, a lot was going on at the time. I think some of it has just got to be, trying to find areas where you can demonstrate that things can be different. We do, I think, on the right, talk about, we make freedom sound like a bit of a burden sometimes, and I think we should think about our language a bit. That it's like for a lot of people, it's all the things that you could rely on the government to give you, schools, healthcare, pensions, universal credit, whatever, that's all going to be stripped away, and you'll be left on your own to sort all these things out. And for most people, that sounds a bit scary. And, I think it is a bit scary, but you have to find another way of framing freedom, that it's giving you power over your own life to do the things that you want to do. It's the kind of arguments made over council houses in the 80s. Your future isn't being a permanent tenant of the local emanation of the state. It becomes your asset. You can then do what you want for it, and that proved to be tremendously liberating for people. And we've got to find ways of modern analogies and modern examples and modern language that show, that freedom is about doing your thing in your way. And this feeling that a lot of people have that, they have no control, they can't really change anything, that their life is just going to carry on like this and just get a bit worse. We've got to break out from that. And I think some of that is the language that we use in trying to paint a different kind of picture. But I think there is a big problem, and this tremendous collectivism you allude to, has bedded down for a long time. And, some of it I think has come from the bank bailouts and the wider sense the government's always behind you. Some of it has come from, in my view anyway, climate, net zero, the endless sort of lifestyle preaching to people so that every decision becomes political. What your car is, where you go on holiday, what food you eat, all this kind of way, what you do with your rubbish. There's no non-political thing where it's just like that's what you do. And so it's kind of crept in the sense the state has the right to a say in the most kind of mundane actions of your life. And we need to, and COVID, of course, made that worse still.
One other angle, which is like, I think resonates with a lot of people, is there's been statements of trying to push the economy in this direction before, and both the key times I can think about it, which is George Osborne and Liz Truss. It's both felt really bad for people. Liz Truss was obviously very immediate and very evident with mortgage prices rocketing up every day. George Osborne was obviously, his kind of big mantra of cutting the size of the state, reducing spending. Obviously, that was in the fallout of a financial crash, but it was also like a political ideology point he was making of we should be, a smaller state. And that
didn't he do triple lock as well?
He did, yes. Yes. Yes, I'm not saying he was entirely consistent all the time, but you had this kind of, a lot of salami slicing, or even salami, just like mass slicing to the government spending in kind of untargeted ways. And it's now we're living through a lot of the ramifications of that, where you have this very weirdly disjointed, the government's trying to continue programs with like just not enough funding, but it's just being kept on life support basically. So people's view of spending cuts is everything just gets worse, rather than this view of, funding was cut, was like this program was ended, but there was space for someone else to come in and fulfill that gap now from a market. So do you think some of this comes back to like actual politicians believing almost in the kind of free market you're pitching and actually having the capability to deliver it properly?
I mean, I'm not sure to what extent Cameron and Osborne really believed in, the empowering the benefits of free markets. I mean, I think they did kind of up to a point, but I don't think they were really kind of convinced supply siders really. They, you're right, austerities associated with them. They cut the ratio of spending to GDP. They didn't really cut what the state did. And in some ways, as you say, they took on more burdens. And now we're seeing the consequences playing out. It's created this mentality of the state can do things and it will always kind of find the money. Again, it comes back to the same things. You have to tell some of the home truths, I think, that it can't always be like that. I think what's happening on health spending now is quite an interesting example, actually, of how we see people responding, because we are actually seeing the development of a market response to the failings of the NHS, is that people are going entirely private in a way that we've never seen before. At the GP level, at the sort of operations level, they've just given up. And, relative prices are such that they can actually afford some of this, and they're doing it. And, the government is kind of unwilling to talk about this, but actually it's a very strong market response, and the supply side on health has actually responded quite quickly to this stimulus. So in a way, it's an example of what can happen if you just create space for it to happen. But because it's in the health sector, people don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting example, actually. I mean, I'm sure they won't mind saying, my parents who are very much fully supportive of NHS, very much kind of always have been, and yeah, they've recently got some private healthcare because of a view of, well, it's just too long wait times, etc. It's just so oversubscribed. There's not enough, and yeah, that would have been 20 years ago. That would have been completely sacrilegious for them to do.
That's right.
And it's interesting. Yeah, you've got this market starting to form, and is kind of your job as in the IEA now and your team. How do you see is part of your desire to highlight these and to say, look, this is where market can fulfill? What's your kind of approach going to be to try and win this battle of ideas?
So I think, we have to, and we will, essentially start trying to describe the barriers to growth and the solutions. In the last couple of years, there are good papers on health reform and planning reform, which have landed sort of on stony ground, really, and nobody's really picked them up. But they are already, really quite effective prescriptions of how bit by bit you unlock the current planning system, how bit by bit you transform the NHS into, a more European style insurance type system. And I think we just need to do more of this and get more impact for them.
This is a bit of a curveball question, but just interesting. You've mentioned Thatcher a couple of times already, and I was just wondering how do you feel about the relationship between free markets and state economic planning? And because you've been an ambassador, you've been in government, you've been a minister, you'll have such a good idea of kind of where it's gone right or where it's gone wrong, but also I don't know how do you kind of how do you marry the two of them, and what would your vision of good kind of interventionist, dare I say, state economic policy kind of look like?
So I think it's a really important question, actually. And one of the things I think, immodestly, I'm unusual in writing is that I don't think growth is only about economics. That's the first thing. I think a lot of it comes from the kind of churn, risk, those sort of things that you have to do to develop growth and profit. They're only possible if you feel you're working within a relatively stable environment in other areas. There's a sense of community, that there's a sense of, I guess, national project, a sense that the country's kind of pulling together and the incentives are all pointing in the same direction, and that the country isn't kind of needlessly making life more difficult for itself, as I would say we are on immigration, for example. The inability to control the borders at the moment is very corrosive of this sense that, we should all be in it together. The sense of free riding is becoming greater and greater. So I actually think, first to answer your question, I know it's not quite the point, but I think it's relevant, is that you've got to have a sense of rebuilding the nation as well as rebuilding the economy. And obviously for me, Brexit is part of that, but it's also things like a proper immigration control. It's about having an effective state, it's about having effective defence policy, for example. And all those things are also part of thinking, okay, this national project is a worthwhile project in which I'm prepared to invest all kinds of other sorts of effort to make myself rich and whatever. You need those two things together, I think. And I think quite often economists sort of forget that wider framing. So that's the first point. Second point, which I think is probably the point of your question, is kind of within that. Okay, what economic activity needs to be directed by the state in order to maintain the country stroke state and boost growth at the same time? And I would say, I think there are two areas for the state to get involved in. One is where there's a national security justification. Obviously, there's room to argue about that. But, steel, for example, or I don't know, shipbuilding has always been. You might say today drones, we have to have a capability of building drones. Give, whatever it takes, we have to be able to do that. And there's obviously room to argue around where the borders are, but I think it exists as a justification. And I think the other is, is there really competition in this industry? Can you really generate effective competition? And I think the water industry is a good example of the problems here. It's probably the one that people most comment on, I suspect. And there isn't really any competition in it. The retail customers can't switch suppliers. Businesses can a bit, and it's complicated and difficult. There isn't really any competition. So we've created this kind of pretend structure that doesn't really work well. And, maybe it would be better to do what I think of as the kind of French solution, which is you accept it's state-run, you try and find extremely capable people to run it with, and you make the incentives as good as you can, and accept that it isn't going to be a market. But obviously the important thing is to try and limit these areas to where it's really necessary and pull back in every other area. So that's quite a long answer, but I think I'm trying to sort of, otherwise if you don't give the framing, you get into these sort of silly disputes that Suella got into the other week. Like, do you believe in nationalisation of steel? Well, it depends. It depends on the context, and that's what's so important.
Yeah, I'm very interested in your view on this kind of where the state needs to, how far the state needs to go, and kind of into a bit more like policy detail on some specific areas. So obviously we don't want you to write policy here, but tax is a big area, which is obviously function of the government. It's always going to receive tax, unless you're full libertarian. Like there's going to be some taxation and revenue generated from the people. The big question obviously right now is what level of tax is right, and a lot of people focus on literally, pegged obviously to the amount you want to spend. But just looking at tax in isolation, do you see those big areas where we can reform the tax system, or things we should be doing which are easy wins, where it currently just doesn't function correctly? 60% tax trap, for instance, people above 100k is one often people think point to. But are there areas where you would say this is an area which is clearly it's not functioning correctly?
So I think the first thing is, if you're trying to drive 40%, 45% of the country's spending, 38% of taxation through the public accounts, you're always going to have problems. At that level, it seems to me like it's inevitable that you're going to have massive deadweight effects, massive diversionary effects, massive distortions, because it's just too big to avoid that. You've just got to raise money from too many people and too many activities. So, it is really important to get the tax burden down. I don't really believe myself in an efficient tax system at 38 or 40 or 45% of GDP. I think it won't work. That said, there are obviously things you could do. As you say, the touch points, the 50k, the 100k, the withdrawal of the allowance, the silly things like when you lose universal credit, when you lose child benefits, when you lose childcare, all these sorts of things could be designed in a more effective way. It's clear, but it would be much better if people paid for these things themselves rather than getting them through benefits through the state and the tax system. I think there's general agreement among economists, I think, that corporate taxation is one of the worst ways of raising money from the point of view of generating investment and growth. So, it's stupid that we've pushed that up. We should be trying to get that down. Turnover transaction taxes as well, like stamp duty. We should be trying to reduce and eliminate those. So I think there are things you can do, but it's obvious that when you just need to raise so much money, this is always going to be extremely difficult.
You're always trapped in that. As you say, like, because you have a child benefit, right, is one which I mean, it was a crazy system right now where you can receive it and then you have to, over a certain threshold, you then have to start paying it back. But like in retrospect, it's a completely insane
it's not
system.
even on a family basis, even though it's a sort of self-evidently family benefit.
Yes.
That if one of you earns a lot, you lose it, and if two earn a bit less, you don't. Which is sort of stupid distortions in the system.
Yeah. And do you? So on the kind of IEA point before we jump into another kind of quick policy area, do you see it as the IEA's job, or do you want to see it as the IEA's job and what you want to push? That you should be arguing kind of at the policy level and talking like specific levers the government can pull here and there, or at this larger like macro vision level of saying actually we need to really fundamentally change how we perceive the role of the state and the role of the country? Or do you see a little bit of both?
I mean, a bit of both, but I think the thing that needs doing really is this: what's the role of the state? They're trying to change the terms of trade on political economy at the moment, because unless you can do that, the other stuff doesn't easily land.
We've seen record emigration levels. So around 3/4 of those who emigrated, I think it was last year, were under the age of 35. Can you outline from your perspective why you think this is happening, and if so, what should we do about it?
I mean, people can't accumulate capital. I think that's the basic reason. And this government has made it worse, but it's definitely happening before summer 2024. I saw evidence of it myself. I think what's happened since this government came in is that the residual hope that a lot of people had that things might get better has probably disappeared, because it's probably only going to get worse for the next few years. So you might as well get out while you can and do it. Do whatever you do somewhere else. And obviously it's easier to be a sort of digital nomad or whatever than it used to be. That's part of it as well. But it's just obviously it's just a vote of total lack of confidence in the system and the predictability of the system, the security of your own assets against government interference or even sort of expropriation through the tax system. And what you're going to have in a economy where spending is 45% of GDP is going to be incredibly difficult to save and accumulate any kind of resources. And when asset prices here are so expensive as well, then that just makes it worse and worse. So I remember when I was ambassador in Denmark being an even higher tax economy now than Britain is, the same phenomenon was very obvious, that people just could not accumulate enough savings to kind of get on the ladder. So the political response there was, I think, not so much to leave, although people did leave, was to call in the government even further. Okay, I can't accumulate enough money to buy this thing myself, so the government's going to have to provide it for me instead. That was the sort of political bargain there. But it's the same underlying cause. And the problem is all these things have the same solution. And we don't need to debate it. We just need to get on with it. And it's tragedy that people are realising how bad things have got just to the moment when we've got a government that doesn't seem to want to do anything about any of these things for a few years.
Do you see any hope, or do you kind of want those that are leaving to stay? And what would you say to them?
I mean, I hope people don't leave, at least for good, because the success of this country is going to rest on energetic, clever people staying and doing things. I guess I would say, but I understand why they go. And, I would probably do the same thing if I was 30 years younger. I hope they don't kind of give up on the country. And again, in the 70s, we saw the brain drain. Lots of people went to America. But they came back in the 80s when things got better. And so I hope people don't kind of permanently give up and never think of coming back. So that's why this next election is so important, really.
Yeah, you have a lot of people who have moved to like San Francisco, right, in the US, and they will touch base often with like LFG and talk about like, really supportive of a movement, etc., because they want to come back. Like, there is a desire. It's definitely like, rather than pull factors of these countries, and they have great elements in the US and in UAE, etc., great kind of incentives to move over there, but a lot of the factors feel like push people feeling, as you say, you can't accumulate wealth. No. You can't even if you start to, you get caught by things like the tax trap, you get caught by things like just the costs of housing, etc.
Yeah, and it is really important, of course, that people can go. However unsatisfactory it is at a kind of human level, things would be a lot worse if you were kind of captive, as in East Germany or whatever, and there was just no way out. What would the government do then? That's the argument for tax havens as well, that however frustrating they are, they provide a limit. That means the government can't just go after, or governments collectively can't just go after businesses indefinitely. That there's a point beyond which they'll say it's not worth it, we'll reincorporate somewhere else. It's the same for individuals. There is a point.
Interesting global counterbalance, right?
Yes.
Obviously, infrastructure is a big one. You've touched on previously about planning reform. This is an interesting area because infrastructure is obviously so capital intensive. Pretty much all the large infrastructure projects I can think of have been majority, if not entirely, funded by government. This is an area as well, which is like people often point to, well, we have to spend because we've got to build X, Y, and Z new road over the next 40 years or however long it takes us now to do anything. But these are some of the big kind of drains on public expenditure. What do you see as like the transition? How would we create? Obviously, before you had public partnerships with mixed results. What would you see as like, how do we kind of rebalance that system so that we can have more private capital going into creating this infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is the whole system's so messed up that, how do you can't expect private capital to respond in a kind of normal incentive-based fashion to these things. They're essentially responding to government rules and regulations rather than the market. And again, that was to some extent obviously the problem with public-private partnerships, I think, though they're still better than just getting the state to do everything. And if you think your way through, would private capital have invested in HS2? I doubt it. Certainly knowing what we know now about the project. To take an easier example, how do you get private capital to, say, build the Lower Thames crossing? The problem, even in our overtaxed country, the problem isn't so much the unavailability of government capital, it's everything else around it. And you bring in private capital, they've still got to deal with the planning system, they've still got to deal with the environmental restrictions, they've still got to deal with the need to kind of consult everybody and Uncle Tom Cobley and all, and none of that changes. So the only way you can get better behaviour is to sweep away all of these things, I think. And then it's good if you can get private capital in. I think it'll definitely be better and you'll get more things done more quickly. But I'm not entirely sure it's the real underlying problem. The real underlying problem is the regulations that make doing anything so difficult and complicated and politically charged. The moment. Yeah,
that political charge point is really interesting because there's one scheme, I won't name it, but one which is in a very prime position in London. It should be able to get private capital. There's no reason why not. It's incredibly valuable land, incredibly valuable kind of businesses they want to put in there. But one of the big issues of it getting off the ground is it seems to be that there's a desire for, there needs to be government approvals through planning and et cetera, but there's also people trying to capture elements where they're trying to make side deals, trying to be, well, if to give you my permission to do this, I need you to do this, I need you to do this, and there's a lot of this kind of just bad incentives at play. Whereas we should be able to strictly go, prime piece of land needs redevelopment. Here's a private corporation or group that want to build on it. If you get to a planning system which should be streamlined, and you can, fund it. Don't ask the government for money, just fund it yourself because you're going to get all returns. Yeah, is that again like how do you how do you see it, like repairing that kind of systemic issue? As you said, there's so many interconnected parts. Everyone's got a little bit of a pie, and they want a little bit for something. And you've got this kind of negotiation going on where everyone's trying to get a little bit out of the deal.
Yeah, I mean it's rational when. Whether you make money or not is basically determined by government regulations. Then you're bound to going to try and shape the regulatory environment and capture some of it rather than focus on doing what you're actually supposed to do. So it's completely rational behaviour in an irrational environment, I think. I mean the model you describe is like Docklands in the 80s, where basically they said you can build anything you want as long as you kind of clear away the mess that was already there. And it took time, though, by modern standards, it came along quite quickly. And I think we should be willing to do more of that. But again, a lot of the politics is against it, and the model goes in a different way. I mean, the much vaunted sort of Teesside development area, Ben Houchin and all of that, it really has rested on bringing in lots of public money to build, forms of economic activity that look dubiously viable, in my opinion. But, set that aside, it's really been done by bringing in the government. And, it would be much better to say just, there's almost no planning rules. Taxes, employment taxes are a lot lower. You don't have to pay corporation tax for 10 years if you invest here. Just come and see what happens. And I'm convinced you get a response to that. But of course, people have got to believe that it will be in place for a long time. And that was the advantage, again, the Thatcher government had in the 80s. When they did this in 83, it looked like you could be confident they were going to be there for a bit. So it was worth taking the risk. That's not so obvious now. But we've really got to, I think it's the best model. We've got to find areas where we can clear away the rules, the regulations, the taxation, all of this, and just say, come and do whatever you want. But it's got to be carefully chosen, otherwise people will react against it.
So we always end the LFG podcast with the same question, and you have to do it in this order. And the question, it's two questions, I guess. What are you most pessimistic about for the future of Britain, and what are you most optimistic about for the future of Britain?
Gosh, pessimistic, just that we can never change the climate, and that the risk that we just become a kind of standard European state with high tax, high regulation, high spending. Everybody looks to the government. I think there's a real risk. And I guess my optimism is the kind of reverse of that we got out of this once before. I do believe the British people, we're very, I think, talented people. We have a kind of historical memory of getting ourselves into scrapes and then getting out of them again. We take bad decisions and then we recover, and you can see that in it's the sort of that's why defeats are kind of more obvious in our national history than successes. And I think we can do this again. We've just got to get ourselves into this position where we believe we've run out of road. We've got to do something different. And when enough people see that, I'm convinced things can change very quickly. But we need the right leadership. We need the ideas, and we need people to explain and sell it. And then it can happen, I think.
Thank you ever so much, David. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you
very much. Cheers.